have another warm round of applause for Pastor David Richardson. I want to begin by thanking Pastor Richardson, and this is literally a program that he put together with his wonderful choral group at almost the last minute, so thank you so much, Pastor Richardson. And we shall hear more from them in a moment. But right now, we want to get the program moving forward. On behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, my name is Paul Ortiz. I'm the director of the program. We have folks coming in from different parts of the county, but we're going to go ahead and get started now. We also have a live stream audience, which is a national and even an international audience, thanks to Bob Ramsey. And I want to begin by saying something which should be obvious to all of us, but I do need to say it. The University of Florida is incredibly honored to be able to welcome Dr. Larry Rivers, the president of Fort Valley State University, to our city. Dr. Rivers' presentation is an important event in the history of our community. His book is going to have a profound impact on the ways we think about slavery, African-American history, and Florida culture. And I want to begin this evening by thanking President and Mrs. Rivers for so graciously honoring us with their presence this evening. Thank you. Please direct your attention to our print program. We want to take this opportunity to thank our many generous co-sponsors who made this event possible. I especially want to acknowledge Dr. Jim Cusick of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History, George A. Smathers Library. Dr. Cusick provided an initial nudge and a creative push to get this program started, and UF Libraries has been integral to this program from the very beginning. But let us thank all of our co-sponsors. We'll skip ahead. Or there she is. Sarah Buck is a recent UF History Honors graduate. She's a staff member of the Oral History Program, and she has a special presentation to make.
Hello, everybody. One benefit to bringing a president of a university to come speak is that he brings a first lady with him. And Mrs. Rivers is cherished in the Fort Valley State University community. In fact, they have a garden dedicated to her there. So on behalf of her love of flowers, the Oral History Program would like to present you with this bouquet. Thank you.
Choral selection. Pastor David Richardson came to the University of Florida in 1986, and this is very important history for our university. He came under the invitation and mentorship of Dr. William Simmons, who was then director of the Institute of Black Culture. And Dr. Simmons plays a tremendous role in the history of this university. So Pastor Richardson started his career of service at UF as an academic advisor, recruiter, a director of the University of Florida Gospel Choir, and after 24 years directing the University of Florida Gospel Choir and leading command performances before audiences as varied as the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus, celebrated artist Melba Moore, and gospel greats Richard Smallwood and Kim Burrell, Pastor Richardson is now directing the alumni of the UF Gospel Choir in a venture to establish a continuing legacy of service from campus to gospel, after campus to our community. He earned his letters of ordination through studies at the Mason Theological Seminary in Memphis, Tennessee, and Good Shepherd Baptist Seminary and Training in Miami, Florida. Please thank Pastor Richardson for his service to this university and to this community. We have one more round of applause for Pastor Richardson. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Larry Rivers, but before I do so, just a few business items. Immediately following the question and answer session that will follow Dr. Rivers' lecture, we'll be moving to the Agora, just in back, for a couple of activities. Dr. Rivers has some books, if you want to purchase a book, and I'm sure you will want to purchase a book after you hear this lecture. We have books for sale. We also have a number of baked goodies. And because my wife, Sheila Payne, baked many of these, I shall be personally insulted to stay with us to have some fellowship afterwards, immediately afterwards. For the Q&A, in your program, there was a little card, and if you have a question for Dr. Rivers, the way we're going to do this is if you can fill out the card with the question, and then we'll have students going around and pass that to your right, and about midway through, we'll collect those questions. We'll get to as many of those as we can this evening, and I'm sure we'll probably run out of time, but then we can continue the dialogue during the book signing, during the reception. On the flip side of that form, by the way, is a survey. I would love, as the director of the oral history program, if you wouldn't mind filling out that survey. Tell us how we can reach you, how we can do a better job of imparting living history, making history exciting. That's what we are in the business of doing. So you have in your program a formal academic introduction of the president of Fort Valley State University, Dr. Larry Rivers. Therefore, I'm going to skip formalities, and I want to tell you just a few things about this remarkable gentleman that you can't necessarily kind of itemize, if you will. Larry Rivers is one of the outstanding university presidents in the United States of America. He combines the classical qualities of an outstanding administrator, scholar, teacher, and public intellectual. And this is an editorial statement. We need more university presidents like Larry Rivers. Dr. Rivers returned to his alma mater, Fort Valley, in 2006 after decades of distinguished teaching and administrative work at Florida A&M University. With the help of his beloved wife, Betty Rivers, he has helped to build and transform Fort Valley into one of the premier historically black universities in the country. Now, if I had to place Dr. Rivers historically, I would compare him with the late Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. And this is why. As many of us know, Dr. Mays was the president of Morehouse College. He was the former dean of the School of Religion of Howard University. And he also was an outstanding scholar, teacher, and university administrator. But wait, there's more. Dr. Mays was an outstanding ethical and intellectual mentor to literally thousands of college students throughout his career. We know the names of some of these former students. Florida legend Howard Thurman, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but most importantly, I think, Dr. Mays was a mentor to countless individuals whose names we don't know. Former students such as Reverend Jefferson Rogers, who was born in Quincy, Florida during World War I. Reverend Rogers went on to become a confidant of Howard Thurman and played an integral role in the civil rights movement. And when I interviewed Reverend Rogers just a few weeks ago, and the man now is 95 years of age, he told me in an oral history interview that Dr. Mays had personally intervened as a university president to ensure that Rogers, a young, penniless man from Quincy, Florida, could attend Howard University in the late 1930s. He intervened personally to make sure that this young man had the resources he needed to start college. To quote Benjamin Mays, "We make our living by what we get. We make our life by what we give." Today, Dr. Rivers is our Benjamin Mays. He has educated and inspired generations of college students. He has taught us that when we open doors for others, the door will always remain open to us. His scholarship on religion, race, relations, slavery, and other topics has made a lasting impact on the trajectory of American history. His address this evening is based on his path-breaking new book, Rebels and Runaways, Slave Resistance in 19th Century Florida. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Rivers to the University.
Isn't it strange? Isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me, we are the builders for eternity. To each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mask, and a book of rules. And each must make in a life of flowing, whether we're going to be stumbling blocks or stepping stones. Isn't it strange? It's not strange that we're here this evening, but we're here this evening to talk about some builders for eternity. Many of them were common people who very few of us know anything about. They had a bag of tools that they used. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things under highly unusual situations. But before I talk about that, let me say good evening to you all, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for you coming out to listen to me this evening. I prepared a 4-hour presentation, but I have gotten it down reasonably to about 20 minutes. Again, thank you for coming. It's great to be in the great city of Gainesville to talk about my new book entitled Rebels and Runaways, Slave Resistance in 19th Century Florida, which I have a few copies available for sale. Don't mind. But let's give Pastor Richardson and the choir another round of applause. I want to thank the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, along with the Bob Graham Center and other organizations for sponsoring this program. And I am so happy that some of my friends are here this evening. I want to recognize, of course, and thank Dr. Paul Ortiz and the Sam Proctor Oral History Program for inviting me to talk about my new book. And I want to say thank you, Paul, for what you've done to help me become a better scholar. I want to thank Dr. James Cusick in the library at the University of Florida for his assistance. Thanks, James. And I see my good friend, Dr. David Coburn, and his wife, Mary. Thank y'all for coming. Dave, I promise I'll try to keep this down to about 20 minutes. I know I haven't seen him, but I hope he's out there, Dr. Mike Denham, who, there you go, Mike. Good seeing you, my friend. Dr. Jan Matthews said that she would try to get here. Thank her for coming. Attorney Sam Stafford. Sam, thanks for coming. Attorney John Dew.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. And others, thank you for coming and helping me celebrate this evening. I want to recognize the many students and other people who are here. Students, if you are here and listening and happy that you're here, give a shout out for yourselves. Clap. Now, I need to make sure that I have a nice, calm evening when this is over. So although she has been introduced, I want to do it again. I want to recognize my wife of 32 years, Betty Jean Hubbard Rivers. Betty has been a supporter of mine, and she pushed me, Dave Coburn, to finish this book, Rebels and Runaways, and she has certainly pushed me to the finish line on many, many projects that I've done. Again, Betty, thanks so much, darling. Now, let's talk a little bit about Rebels and Runaways. My first book, entitled Slavery in Florida, Territorial Days to Emancipation, came out about 12 years ago. This book, Rebels and Runaways, is a continuation of my research into antebellum Florida history. By the end of my presentation, I hope you will see why I feel that this book is different from similar studies of slave resistance in the antebellum South, and why I think this study is very important to understanding the diverse and rich history of Florida and this nation. Isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that caper and sawdust rings and common people like you and me, we are the builders for eternity. Yes, the people I will talk about for a few minutes this evening were indeed common people. They were ordinary people. Nobody knew much about them, but they were builders for eternity. They were ordinary people, and I believe sincerely that they did extraordinary things. They were not well-known personalities. You could not find a lot of them in the history books, but nevertheless, they had a dynamic impact on American history. See, this book that I wrote is not simply about tragedy of a group of people. It's about triumph. It's about celebrating the lives of ordinary people. It's about talking about their humanity, the humanity of these people. It's about their suffering. It's about their agency to do things for themselves. It's about their perseverance. It's about their love of family. It's about the impact that these common people, these ordinary people, had on the history of Florida. It's about love for territory. It's about love for a state that did not, during that period, love them back. I want to say this with a clear voice, that I did not treat these human beings as only victims, but as people who spoke up for their freedom, who ran away to gain their freedom, and are people who fought many times from the 1500s up to the Civil War in order to gain their freedom. I hope this book will clearly demonstrate that these enslaved blacks were active participants in fighting for their freedom. Indeed, they were not passive participants, but active participants in their freedom. And I strongly believe that the story of these people, as well as the story of other ordinary, common, inarticulate people who have been forgotten many times, should be woven into the very fabric of the history of this nation. For these people had one thing, these enslaved blacks had one thing I'm sure of, and that is faith. For faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. These ordinary people, these enslaved human beings, had a faith in Almighty God, a faith in their ancestors, and a faith in themselves. They had a faith within that no one could take from without, and the desire and the hope one day to be free and treated like other human beings. For many times, the only thing these human beings had was the love for each other and their faith, and the strong belief that better days were ahead. And with this talk, I want to accomplish several goals. I want to show how this book is unique and quite different from similar studies. I want to talk about how enslaved blacks in Florida responded to their enslavement from 1821 to 1865. I want to tell the story of the agency of enslaved blacks in Florida. I want to show in this book that enslaved blacks took charge of their own lives. I want to show why slave resistance was much more successful in Florida than in other southern states because of its destination as a maroon territory or runaway slave haven. Indeed, contemporaries of the time properly called Florida a runaway slave haven. I want to talk briefly about how some runaways had an Atlantic worldview which made escape for them somewhat different from other enslaved runaways. Next, I want to talk briefly about one method used by some of these Atlantic worldview runaways in making their escape to freedom. And I know many of you have heard about the famous Underground Railroad that you have read about so often in our history books. But how many of you have heard about what I call the reverse Underground Railroad? Let me repeat, the reverse Underground Railroad that many Florida runaways used to make their escape to freedom. So I will talk about what I call the reverse Underground Railroad. I have many people who ask me, what about this Underground Railroad? I will talk about that, just like I will talk about the Second Seminole War, which I call a Black Indian Rebellion. And then I will end my presentation with a few words about enslaved blacks' participation in the American Civil War. I know I have a lot to talk about in 15 minutes now. So let me start really going through this really fast. From my study rebels and runaways, those who fought against the institution of slavery in Florida had a somewhat better chance of achieving freedom in Florida than in other southern states for several reasons. Florida was a large piece of real estate. During the early statehood period that began in 1845, it claimed second place as the largest state east of the Mississippi River. After Virginia divided during the Civil War, Florida became the largest state in the Union. It possessed vast tracts of unpopulated territory, which made it an easy destination for runaways and rebels to establish maroon communities and hide away for literally hundreds of years, dating back to the 1500s in Florida. And with so much real estate remaining poorly policed, with few people in certain areas, well up to the 19th century, historian James M. Denon quoted correctly when he referred to La Florida at this time as a Rhodes paradise because of the vast number of maroon communities that existed and all of the tension that existed during this period of time. From the Spanish period of the 1500s to the Civil War, enslaved runaways knew about Florida as a maroon community and as the headquarters for organizing rebellion and resistance. Indeed, the history of Florida as a runaway slave haven dates back to the founding of St. Augustine during the 16th century, and by 1738, as Kathleen Deegan has noted, Florida had the first known free black community of runaways in North America called Fort Mose. And as Peter Wood noted, many of the rebels of the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina were headed to the free black community of Fort Mose before they were captured. Also, the history, the climate, the topography, and geography made Florida an excellent place to establish maroon communities that lasted for literally, like I said, hundreds of years up to the Civil War, excuse me. By 1837, Florida boasted at least 6 well-known runaway slave havens. Of course, Fort Mose, Picklakaha, Angola, Negro Fort, Swanee, Negro Town, Manatee, Mulatto Girls Town, and many more. Again, history, geography, location, climate, typography, and the large expanse of real estate made Florida ideal as a runaway slave maroon territory up to the 1860s. So no other southern state, I believe, had as many runaway slave havens as did Florida. I want to emphasize this again. Based upon my research, very few studies really look at the significance of slave havens or maroon communities and fomenting rebellion like this study does for Florida. Some Florida rebels and runaways had what I call an Atlantic worldview. That is, they knew more about the outside world than most other enslaved blacks during the antebellum period. How many studies of slavery look at enslaved blacks with an Atlantic worldview? Indeed, some of Florida's fugitives knew that freedom could be achieved through or by the use of water, sometimes as far south as the Bahama Islands. In fact, one Army officer during the Civil War said as much when he said, and I quote, "The finest men physically were from Florida. These men, having been pilots and fishermen, had more knowledge of the world than those slaves from South Carolina who had lived chiefly on isolated plantations all of their days," unquote. When looking at Florida as a whole, many East and West Florida fugitives possessed an Atlantic worldview, at least a sense that freedom lay east across the water or through the use of water. Many of these enslaved blacks in Northeast Florida worked at port towns like St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Fernandina, and Apalachicola. And while working at these port towns, some of these enslaved blacks talked with other blacks and whites coming from Europe and the Caribbean and other places about what was happening all over the world. And many of these blacks and whites continued to talk about the happenings all over the world. How much do we know about the role that black mariners played in the resistance movement in antebellum South? Well, one important point I want to mention is that black mariners docking in East and West Florida from places like Europe, the Caribbean, northern states, indeed knew about other worlds as well. Some of these black mariners participated in the resistance movement, at least in Florida, by assisting runaways with making their escape to freedom. So when many of these Northeast fugitives fled their masters and servitude, they did not necessarily think about escaping to another place in the South, but escaping to some place over the water with the help of black mariners to another Atlantic world place. In fact, one of many examples come to mind to bring the Atlantic world perspective of some Florida bondsmen in clear view. For example, in her excellent book, Patricia C. Griffin helps to tell the story of Satike. In his own words, Satike possessed an Atlantic world viewpoint and had settled in East Florida. He was uprooted from West Africa, and Satike held memories of his forced immigration from his West African homeland and the long voyage he endured across the Atlantic, which is called the Middle Passage. The captain landed in North America at Charleston, South Carolina, although later he was taken to Savannah, Georgia. There, Josiah Smith purchased him, renamed him Jack Smith. Shortly after, Jack moved with the Smith family to Watertown, Connecticut, before relocating again 1 year later to St. Mary's, Georgia. He ultimately reached St. Augustine in 1817. As its narrative detailed, Satique then lived through the Spanish period, the territorial period, the antebellum period, the Civil War period, and the Reconstruction era in Florida before passing away in 1882. Through those years, the one-time African exerted significant influence on enslaved blacks with whom he came in contact, whether as an ordained clergyman, a teacher, neighbor, or friend. If one knew Satique, the world outside of Florida became less of a mystery. And there are many examples of enslaved blacks like Satique who knew that there was a world outside of Florida. But we really never hear about those runaways who had an Atlantic world perspective. We normally hear about runaways who left one state with the intention of reaching another state instead of trying to leave the country. And Satike's president, St. Augustine, offers a partial examination why the town and other port towns became the destination for many runaways who wanted to escape to some place of freedom across the ocean. This also led to another point about the reverse Underground Railroad. How many of you have heard, as I stated, about this reverse Underground Railroad? Well, you hear of bond servants, runaways like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and others helping runaways escape on foot by way of the Underground Railroad that went from the south to the north to places like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, and Canada. But do you commonly hear of an Underground Railroad that went from the south, particularly from Florida, by water this time, further south into the British Bahamas, especially after slavery was outlawed by the British in the Bahamas after 1834. A reverse. We don't read about it in the history books. When we talk about the Underground Railroad, we're always talking about enslaved blacks leaving the South, trying to get through all those states to freedom. But we don't hear much about the Underground Railroad that I say was a reverse Underground Railroad. Many of them went by water, as I stated, to the Bahamas. Here is one example I like to cite. The St. Augustine News reported that 7 fugitives had departed St. Augustine for the Bahamas, where emancipation had gained the force of law on August 1st, 1834. And according to various accounts, 2 of the escapees had been employed as sailors on board the schooner Walter, a vessel in the service of the United States. They planned their escape well, taking with them 3 7-stands of muskets, a compass, and sufficient food and provisions to last them for some time. They traveled in a stolen pilot boat up and down the Atlantic coastline near present-day Miami. The fugitives picked up 2 additional fugitives before landing briefly at Key Biscayne. The newspaper continued by saying, and I quote, "Should these Negroes succeed in reaching the Bahama Islands, they are to be immediately demanded by the United States government." 5 weeks passed before the newspaper mentioned the runaways again. And when the newspaper mentioned, it noted that they have arrived in the Bahamas, but repeated attempts by Florida authorities to extradite the fugitives back to Florida had failed repeatedly. This is one of several examples of runaways not trying to get further north, but going the reverse Underground Railroad to different parts of the Caribbean, particularly the Bahamas, and seeking freedom. Let me say that I found other examples of runaways attempting to leave by boat, hiding away, and in fact, my study suggests that 1 in 5 runaways use the waterways of Florida in order to make their escape. I don't know how many use the waterways in other states because most studies really do not focus on the waterways and runaways making their escape. They usually talk about runaways on foot, runaways in horse and carriage, etc. But I think we really need to take a look at the waterways. And if you look at where Florida was located, all the waterways, it would seem like that was logical. Runaways using the various waterways throughout the South became common. Many runaways who went north did so when they ran away to get with family members. So did some of the runaways who went further south to get with family members who were sold to various parts of the Caribbean. One thing I want to say about runaways. Runaways varied. You had truant runaways, those who ran away for a couple days. You had those who left because they were disgruntled. You had those who were true fugitives, left with no intentions on returning. But why do you think most of them ran away? Did they run away because of mistreatment? Did they run away because of cruelty? Some did, but a lot ran away so that they could be reunited with family members. Someone sold away from them. And one thing that was characteristic of Florida at this time, during what we call the migration during the 1820s and 30s of white settlers leaving Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, looking for fertile land in which to grow staple crops, cotton and other products. And they could purchase land around 1825, 1830, an acre land in Florida for $1.25 an acre. So they looked forward to settling in Florida because of the idea that this was fertile land in middle Florida and they could get rich quick. But the thing that these families did not really think about was the impact of their relocation on black families. One thing that I found out about the white families in Virginia, that they were clannish. They believed in taking care of each other. So when they uprooted themselves, they took entire family members with them. But when it came to their enslaved black families, they only took the most able workers, leaving grandmom in Virginia, leaving granddad, leaving older uncles, and only the young, while the whites kept their families intact. There was no consideration for keeping the black families that toiled night and day for them intact. And that's why many of the runaways that I investigated left Florida, heading back to the Carolinas, to Virginia, not necessarily because of mistreatment, but the desire to relocate with loved ones who had been separated. And one thing, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau, you can find many of these now freed blacks who went to other states and found loved ones who were separated and married them. There are cases after cases in the Freedmen's Bureau to indicate that family to these individuals meant a lot, and that they were going to do whatever they could to get with family. Also, I want to say a little bit about what I call the Black Indian Rebellion, more commonly known as the Second Seminole War. I believe, looking back, that even the First Seminole War was a slave rebellion. And let me get a reason. Writing in 1818, Representative Henry Baldwin of Pennsylvania claimed that the Georgia militia under Andrew Jackson was, and I quote, in fact, were suppressing an insurrection, a rebellion of slaves aided by Indian force, all assembled and armed for the purpose hostile to the country, unquote. And from the vantage point of the 1850s, Congressman Joshua Giddings believed that both the First and Second Seminole Wars, as they were caused by enslaved blacks who rose up in rebellion. Why, Giddings was asked, did the fact of slavery being the cause of these rebellions escape mention in the historical record or in our history books? Here is what Giddings said about that, and I quote, there was great delicacy exhibited and had been for many years previously in regard to the agitation of any question touching on the institution of slavery. And the people of the free slave states appeared and felt that silence on any disturbances, silence on the subject of slavery was necessary upon every citizen who desired the continuation of the Union. Giddings went on to say that U.S. officials sold the First and Second Seminole Wars as owing to Indian murders on the frontier and not slave rebellions. Indeed, these slave rebellions were fomented many times by runaway blacks from northeast Florida. The Black and Indian Rebellion, I believe, was a slave insurrection. And the general who was fighting in the Second Seminole War said, and I quote, "You can be sure this is a Negro, not an Indian war," unquote. General Jessup further believed that if the Black Indian Rebellion was not, and I quote, speedily put down, the South, not just Florida, but the entire South would feel the effects of it on the slave population before the end of this season, unquote. Jessup's perception of his black opponent's ability and resolve led him quickly to realize that his struggle with these black runaways would be a long one. Yet he thought he could put down the rebellion swiftly. He misjudged the agency of many of these runaways. I can't say this enough. These runaways did not look at themselves as victims, but as people determined to fight and die for their liberty and the protection of their family and their land. Unlike Denmark, V.C., Gabriel Prosser, and Nat Turner, these runaways did not want to particularly overthrow slavery throughout the United States. They simply wanted to defend the land that they had been on, going all the way back sometimes to the Spanish period. And at the same time, whites coming in claiming more land, there was a conflict. They were not out to do anything but protect their families, maintain their liberty in their maroon communities, and make sure they held on to the land. Yes, we don't read much about the Black Indian Rebellion in our history books. I strongly believe that this revolt needs to be a part of the discussion when talking about slave rebellions in the antebellum South. It is my position that few historians appreciate Florida's experience as a place where slave rebellion and race war indeed took place, since many of them continue to cite, as I stated, the more well-known popular rebellions, the Stono, Denmark, V.C., Gabriel Prosser, and Nat Turner. And recently, there's a good book out, and it says that it was the largest slave rebellion, the Louisiana Uprising of 1811. But when you look at pure numbers, anywhere from 750 to 1,000 runaways participated in the Black Indian Rebellion, most of them from the plantations of Northeast Florida. Students of slavery, like Cannon Brown Jr., J.B. Byrd, and others, believe, like I do, that the Second Seminole War was really a slave rebellion that occurred from 1835 to 1842. And they say that because the size, scope, and intensity, it was the longest sustained slave insurrection to befall the South prior to the Civil War. And it all happened, yes, right here in the fourth largest state in the Union. This revolt did not receive much national attention while it flared, nor during its aftermath. But with the few exceptions of the historians I previously cited, we don't hear much about this rebellion. In fact, contemporary accounts published in Florida, as I stated, with documents to support it, said anywhere from 750 to 1,000 runaways participated in this rebellion. Unlike some slave rebellions, there was no one person, but many individuals who participated. You just did not have a Denmark Vesey or a Nat Turner. You had people like John Horse, people like Ben Bruno, John Caesar, all of them participated in this rebellion. I know time, and my wife has said that I've gone beyond my time, so let me look at one more aspect, and after that, another 10 more aspects. No, just one more, and that is the participation of enslaved blacks in the Civil War. Here again, a lot of the enslaved blacks who participated in the Civil War came from Northeast Florida. Thanks to Dan Schaefer's work, we know a lot about who they were and how they fought. And they wanted to make sure that America did not develop selective amnesia, that somehow enslaved blacks did not fight for their own freedom in the war. And that's why Private Thomas Long expressed his desire to put his life on the line so that his family could be free, and most importantly, to show future generations that blacks were willing to participate and die in the war. That they fought and died for their freedom. Long and others yearned to make sure that the agency of blacks and their willingness to fight for their own freedom remained clear. When he said, and I quote, he never wanted his children to hear that your father never fought for his freedom, unquote. Fighting for their own freedom meant a lot to Private Long and other blacks during this period. And I want to say, in summary, that given Florida's history as a beacon of freedom, a slave haven for runaways, its geography, typography, its setting for the largest, deadly, and costliest race war, slave rebellion in American history, its enslaved inhabitants who had an Atlantic world perspective, Florida rebels and runaways resisted with mindsets, perspectives, and aims that differed significantly from those of other southern states. Or were runaways from Florida really that different? Well, without careful examination on the micro level, can we really know whether Florida is unique as I'm claiming it to be? So I'm calling for additional studies on 19th century resistance in other southern states and even regional experiences within individual states to be done in the near future. But one thing I can say, that enslaved Floridians resisted and rebelled. They continued to do so far and wide, when and how they could, until the goal of freedom was achieved. And that the long and complex saga of Florida's rebels and runaways form a key element to understanding the history of Florida and the history of this nation. Thank you very much.
While Dr. Rivers freshens up a little bit, we're going to have 10 minutes for questions and answers. And Diana is going to time us and tell us when we reach that threshold. And I'd also like to, while we're kind of freshening up, to acknowledge all of the hard work of the staff and the students and the volunteers of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Would you all please stand and be acknowledged? That following this, we'll have a book signing, we have a reception, and the close of the formal part of the evening, immediately following Q&A, Pastor Richardson has kindly agreed to give the benediction. So please try to stay for that. So there are a lot of really good questions, and we tried to go directly to the students. I'll take the first question for Dr. Rivers. Will be, I noticed in your book that you use direct quotes from former slaves. Where did you get these quotes from? And why did you decide to leave the quotes in non-standard English?
Great question. I got a lot of the quotes from newspapers that I gathered in Jacksonville and St. Augustine. A lot of these newspapers were published in the 1920s that did interviews of former slaves. I also looked through the Works Progress Administration. During the Depression, a lot of former slaves were interviewed, and I really thought that the interviews of the former slaves in Florida were particularly good. I left it in the former slaves' language because I wanted you to get a true sense of what they were saying, and I did not want to misinterpret by rewriting it. So I left it in the language of the former slave.
Okay, the next question, Dr. Rivers, is how did male slaves and female slaves rebel differently? Differences between male and female?
Good, great. A lot of the female, and I have a picture in my book, a lot of the female slaves rebelled by simply talking to the authority figure, saying when they felt that they were overloaded, they just spoke up, and as my mama used to say, I'm gonna give you a piece of my mind. They gave the authority figures a piece of their mind, knowing that sometimes they would be chastised for it, but they weren't reluctant to do it. They didn't hide in doing it. And sometimes, if they didn't like their work assignments, they would simply say that they didn't like it and they would prefer to do something else. Well, the guys didn't do as much talking with their mouths as running with their feet. They would take off a lot of times when they were hot, and many of them, we call them truant runaways. They would stay away for a couple days, cool off, take their lickings, and go back to work. So a lot of times, women would just simply speak up, slow down. Some of them were sick a lot of times when they really were not sick, so they would take sick days when they wanted. So they used the system as much as they could. I found, of course, that male enslaved blacks ran away more often than the females. The females would take off, and a lot of times they had children that slowed them down, and many times they were captured, brought back. And so a lot of them didn't attempt to do that unless they were going to be escorted by a male. So when you look at that dynamic, that's a few of the differences between the male runaways and the female runaways.
Dr. Rivers, for runaway slaves that were unfortunate enough to be caught, what punishment did they face? And did women and men receive different punishment?
Well, in my study, 99% of the time, whether it was a female or male, when they were caught, they were brought back and they were flogged or whipped in front of the rest of the slave community as an example of what not to do, and if you did it, this is what you would receive. So very few times was there a real difference between the punishment for a female runaway versus a male runaway. There had to be punishment brought to bear as an example of what would happen if someone else tried to do what that male or female did.
Dr. Rivers, what were the Seminoles doing to be humane and accepting to runaway slaves?
Well, when you got to look at this from a larger perspective. When white settlers started coming in, many of them settled in what we call the plantation region of middle Florida. As they began to populate this area, they started moving further down the peninsula and started having conflicts with Seminoles and land. We got to look at this in a big picture. From really the 1500s up to 1865, it was about land, it was about who controlled the land, and it was about who controlled the labor on the land. And when Seminoles, Creeks, and others came in conflict over land rights, there was a fight. And a lot of times, runaways would join up with Seminoles. Sometimes they would live in the Seminole villages. Sometimes they would live in villages next to the Seminoles. It was a combination thereof. And they both knew, as far as they were concerned, that there was a common enemy. And that was whites coming in, taking the land. And so they bonded in order to deal with what they perceived as an interloper coming in, taking land that they had settled on for decades or hundreds of years. So that's how the relationship developed and continued.
Dr. Rivers, what contemporary lessons does your study of slave resistance have for us today, especially given the outcome of the 2012 presidential election?
Oh, that's fun. I thought that's going to come somewhere around there. I think one thing my study does is show that the legacy of slavery is still with us based upon the attitudes of some people. And in order for us to move beyond that, we need to understand the history of diverse people and their contributions and get beyond that. But I think many of the attitudes of some people today is the legacy of slavery. And I try in my book to explain how this evolved over time and why some attitudes persist. And, we got a president who was reelected, and some of us may have issues with it, but as Paul Ryan said, he was elected fair and square, and I think now we all have to come together and move this country forward. We cannot continue to be divided if we're going to really move this country, and we really need to come together. We got some financial situations. I'm going into commentary here, but we got some we got some financial situations. We got young people who are graduating from great universities like the University of Florida who need jobs. So we got to come together, and we cannot say because this group is doing this, well, we got to compromise. If we don't, we're going to have another 4 years of gridlock, and it will not be good for this great country.
We have time for one more question, and Dr. Rivers, this kind of dovetails from your previous question. Dr. Rivers, what advice do you have for undergraduate students?
My advice to undergraduate students, and I'm going to say undergraduate students at the University of Florida, is that you get a great, well-rounded education, and that you don't leave Florida without your degree, and that while you're here, you make it an effort to deal with someone from a different ethnic and racial group. Get to know someone outside your comfort zone, because in the real world, when you get out, you're going to be dealing with many people from diverse backgrounds. You might as well start here, because you cannot live in a cocoon. You cannot live in an isolated world. The demographics of this country is changing. So we have to understand that things are changing, and that we have to work with individuals while they're changing, again, to move this country forward and to make it an even better place to live. Thank y'all very much.
Pastor Richardson, if you can give the benediction, please, sir.
Thank you. May we all stand. Lord, as we prepare to leave this place, we thank you for the information. We thank you for this awesome presentation. Thank you for this potent discussion. God, we thank you for the information that we received. We pray, Brown, that you would bless us, shroud us with your peace, shroud us with your love. Thank you for such an awesome orator as Dr. Rivers. God, we thank you now. Bless us, and we shall be blessed. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. Please join us in reception, book signing, and